internalized misogyny, institutionalized sexism, the patriarchy. TRIGGR. Warning. Throughout this video, I'll be quoting from the video Damsel in Distress, Part 2, Tropes versus Women in Video Games. Anita frequently uses sensationalized language to enrage her audience. If you get angry or offended easily, fuck off. Anita once again begins with her same opening statement that it is necessary for us to maintain a certain level of cognitive dissonance when playing video games, enjoying them, but also being keenly aware of their pernicious aspects. So let's see how pernicious these video games are, shall we? She continues with her definition of the damsel of distress, adding a damsel character is not necessarily always just a one-dimensional character entirely defined by victimhood. This flexibility in her application of the damsel trope allows her to dismiss any female characters that do actually have depth, or funny, or interesting, or are integral to the story, if at any point they have been shown to be in a vulnerable situation. She goes on to say that periodically game developers may attempt to build a more fleshed out relationship between the male and the female character. I would think that this is a good thing, but Anita dismisses this type of character development by citing some examples as patronizing and then saying that it is only used as an easy way for writers to trigger an emotional reaction in male players, by then exploiting the established relationship by putting the female character in a vulnerable situation. These two claims are somewhat at odds, since the suggestion in the former is that game developers are rarely successful in building a relationship, and that the latter, that the relationship that the developers attempted to but presumably failed to build, is now being exploited just so they could put the female in danger. In reality, this is just how storytelling works. You need to introduce conflict or drama, and putting someone in close relationship with the protagonist into a dramatic situation is an effective way of doing that. Also, I'm pretty sure I don't have male genitals, but I sometimes feel protective of the characters in the games I play. I say pretty sure, since Anita doesn't deal in absolutes. Many of the claims Anita makes in this video are peppered with qualifiers, such as oftentimes, feels like, periodically, or that something tends to something else. These make her statements more vague, less susceptible to specific counterpoints, and give her more flexibility in defending them. These qualifiers are a tool she uses to frequently build up her wall of bullshit that she hides behind. Must be smelling. She continues with narratives that frame intimacy, love, or romance as something that blossoms from or hinges upon the disempowerment and victimization of women are extremely troubling, because they tend to reinforce the widespread regressive notion that women in vulnerable, passive, or subordinate positions are somehow desirable because of their powerlessness. Let's carefully take this quote apart, because there's a lot of stuff going on in this sentence. Female characters in games that they aren't the main protagonists of are by definition only secondary. The entire romantic background of relationship is really outside the scope of a game, and not what players are interested in, outside of BioWare fans. It is understandable that a relationship would grow from the two characters that underwent a tough situation under the hands of some villain. Why is this extremely troubling? Anita says that it is because they reinforce the notion that women in vulnerable positions are desirable because of their powerlessness. And not only this, but that this notion is widespread. Maybe in some cultures, but women being helpless is not something I would agree with as being desirable, and it's not really seen too much in first world countries. If you take her spiel and apply it to romance novels, now that is something. It is fair to compare the two, as romance novels are primarily read by women, and Anita seems to think that only men are marketed to in video games. Romance novels are largely written by women for women. In my opinion, they are a far worse medium for setting an ideal on how relationships should be and how women should act. The damsel in distress is rampant in the romance genre. It is also prevalent in young adult books for teenage girls. Of course, the most popular example is Twilight, where an abusive relationship is viewed as the ideal, and to be rescued again is like totally dreamy. The popularity of this book has set many ripoffs with basically the same plot, spreading like mold in a damp basement. Thankfully, it is fading with strong female characters becoming popular. These kind of books are more damaging, in my opinion, than video games to irrational people, like teenagers. Most grow out of it and only visit the fantasy in their mind for fun. I say most because there will always be women out there pining for something that doesn't exist, and vice versa for men. It's not the default, though. Moving on. While explaining the women in the refrigerator trope, Anita says that training female characters' lives for something meant to resemble male character development is part of a long media tradition. Shouldn't the death of a female character with the relationship to the male character result in some sort of character development? A more insidious trope, her word, not mine, that Anita talks about is the damsel in the refrigerator. This is when a villain murders the female and then also traps their soul. You know, I think insidious might be Anita's favorite word. She uses it a lot. Well, no, maybe it's regressive, or disempowerment, or victimized, or grisly. Who am I kidding? Of course it's misogyny. The point is that she reuses the same emotionally loaded buzzwords over and over again to drill into her audience just how offended they should be. Later, she says that developers must be hoping that by exploding sensationalized images of brutalized women, it will be enough to fool gamers into thinking that the games are becoming more emotionally sophisticated. Let's be clear that she is suggesting devs are purposefully injecting the sensationalized imagery to fool gamers. That is, to manipulate them into believing that the game is more emotionally sophisticated. She continues with, the truth is that there's nothing mature about most of these stories, and that many of them cross the line into blatant misogyny. Wow, really? Which ones? She doesn't name names. This is another one of those vague statements that you should just accept as gospel and be alarmed about. If she had serious ammo to back up her claims of rampant misogyny in the game industry, this would have been a good time to use it. The nearest clip to this statement that she has used, it was from Dante's Inferno, which was released in 2010. It shows a woman being stabbed. So I went and looked up the plot to this game, and it turns out it is actually really complex. I don't think it exactly follows the book, but there is a lot of murdering and sin and soul saving going on as the protagonist goes through the 9 circles of hell. Another trope, the euthanized damsel, occurs when the character is forced to put a damsel out of her misery, where she says that the player must murder the woman in peril for her own good. I would like to reiterate, like I did in my last video on her damsel in distress, part 1, whatever it's called. There are only so many plots. There are said to be 36 dramatic situations by Georges Pulte, the euthanized damsel. This is mercy killing. Could you do it? These scenes are gut-wrenching. It is a popular trope because it's relatable and you can emphasize with it. It isn't used because of hate towards women. It's because of love, of our humanity. In some games, you could even call it assisted suicide. What if it was your loved one that was in terrible pain, just wanting it to stop? Think about that right now. Think about someone you care about in a situation where they just want it to end. That feeling you're experiencing right now, it is why this euthanized damsel is a powerful plot device in stories. Another example of this in a game that Anita didn't include in her showcasing of games that this is in is The Walking Dead. Okay, there's some mild spoilers about to happen. There is an assisted suicide with a woman. There is a mercy killing with a woman. And there is also a mercy killing with a man. But this wasn't included. She didn't bring this up. All of this about mercy killing made me think of a movie, The Fly. Spoiler, the afflicted in this movie has turned into a monster and is mercy killed. The monster was male and the one doing the shooting was female, but how would it have really been that different if the genders were reversed? Would it really been so much more insidious if the monster was a female and the shooter was a male? An example Anita uses for this euthanized damsel trope is clips from Prey, a game that came out in 2006. In her video, we see a clip of a monster woman begging to be killed. What Anita edited out was that the male protagonist refused, saying that he would save her. She has to tell him that there is no way that he could save her, and for him to please kill her. After the deed is done, a female voice, the bad guy, girl, taunts the protagonist, and he lashes out because he is freaking distraught at what he had to do. This is perfectly reasonable in the context of the game's universe. Anita then goes on to say, these damseled women are written as to subordinate themselves to men. They submissively accept their grisly fate and will often beg the characters to perform violence on them, giving men direct and total control over whether they live or die. What? That is just plain wrong. They are in control. They are the ones telling the heroes to end their suffering. She then says, in other words, these women are asking for it. Quite literally. No shit! They're asking for it, but they aren't in control. What? Was she trying to do the whole thing about, like, women are asking to be beat or raped? I mean, what is going on here? This is really Anita's cue again to your audience to work up their outrage. However, in the context of these games, these actions these players perform are the most logical and ethical. Yes, it is a device used to deepen the player's connection to the story, but so what? This is how storytelling works. There are tons of movies about aliens invading Earth. Does that mean you shouldn't see Mars Attacks because you've seen Independence Day? No, they're totally two different movies. They're both good in their own right, but they use a lot of the same plot devices and cliches to get there. Let's continue. She then shows another montage of games, including a game called Grab by the Ghoulies, which has very cartoony violence. She uses this clip multiple times. Referring to those games, she says, in each case, violence against women is used to bring women back to their senses. That is the bad guy's plan. To make you kill or hurt what you love? And yeah, it's fucked up. That's why he's the bad guy. These games are insane that by hitting someone in real life, by beating on them or bringing them to the brink of death will bring them back to their senses. She continues, these stories conjure up supernatural situations in which domestic violence appears justified as an altruistic act done for the women's own good. What about the demonic beasts that look like women? Just because of a particular event might make sense within the eternal logic of a fictional narrative, that does in and of itself justify its use. Games don't exist in a vacuum, and therefore we can't be divorced from the larger cultural context of the real world. Alright, let's apply this to Mario. He kicks Koopa Troopas, and okay, so let's apply this to real world. Does this mean it's going to lead to animal cruelty against turtles? Animal cruelty is a real thing in the world. Maybe they had Mario depicting it in some terrible, wrong way. Nina then talks about the epidemic of violence against women and gives some stats on the problem. But do not be distracted by Anita's PSA. Of course, domestic violence is bad. But that doesn't mean Anita can invent her own system of logic or otherwise make unsubstantiated claims. I would also like to add that none of the violence against women in the clips she has shown in the video show the male hero being happy about these hurt and dead women. The only happy people are the bad guys, because they're the bad guys and they're doing bad things. These depictions of violence aren't shown in a positive light. In fact, I would say that it shows how disgusting this abuse is. I would say this even applies to GTA 3. You know from the start that your character is a criminal and a dick. Let's continue. Given the reality of the larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it is dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged or even required to perform violence against women in order to save them. No, it doesn't go without saying. Why again is it that things which are ethical in the context of a fictional universe dangerously irresponsible in the real world? The problem with Anita, and I think most who are against all video game violence, is that they don't understand that people, rational people, know when they're playing a video game and when they're not, and what type of behavior is appropriate in each circumstance. After knocking out your girlfriend who is turned into an ogre by throwing bottles at her, like Anita shows from Grabbed by the Ghoulies, she's afraid that someone will go and throw bottles at their girlfriend in real life? She continues with, game creators aren't necessarily sitting around twirling their nefarious looking mustaches while consciously figuring out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy. Her earlier statements suggested game devs were complicit. Developers must be hoping that by exploiting sensationalized images of brutalized women, it will be enough to fool gamers into thinking that their games are becoming more emotionally sophisticated. And also note that in this subtext, in part one, her part 1 video at 6:52, she frames Miyamoto as someone who frequently employs the damsel in distress trope, and in the case of Star Fox Adventures, deliberately strips out an existing female protagonist and recasts her as a damsel in distress. And that Miyamoto doubled down with the release of Zelda. You can find that at 1335 in part 1. Throughout this video, Anita avoids using absolutes as much as possible by peppering almost every sentence with qualifiers. This contributes to her overly verbose manner of speaking that she has adopted. Her habit becomes almost comical with the string of sentences in the previous quote, because by saying that they aren't necessarily twirling their mustaches, she's leaving open the possibility that maybe there are some out there with nefarious mustaches and that they will twirl them while looking for ways to misrepresent women. Back to what she was saying. One of the really insidious things about systematic and institutional sexism is that most often progressive attitudes and harmful gender stereotypes are maintained and perpetuated unintentionally. Don't worry, it's not your fault you're a misogynist. It is perpetuated systematic sexism. We typically don't have a monkey see, monkey do relationship with the media we consume. Cultural influence works in much more subtle and complicated ways. However, media narratives do have a powerful cultivation effect, helping to shape cultural attitudes and opinions. Excuse me, I'm just swimming through shit here. Just because Anita states this does not mean in any way that she hasn't been heavily implying that all this violence against women shown in video games makes it seem okay. She's just saying it in a more subtle and complicated way. Although these stories use female trauma as the catalyst, the only catalyst, these are not stories about women. Instead, they are strictly male-centered stories. She's right. These are male-centered stories, and this is exactly why the women only play secondary roles in these sometimes cliched plot devices. She then complains about women being stereotypes. Well, side characters don't have much background put into the game. They're giving enough for you to know, okay, this is what they look like, and okay, they're mischievous, or they're nice, or they're broody, etc. Person. If you fleshed out every single character in a game, it would get boring and long, don't you think? Both genders fall into stereotypes in video games. Remember in her previous video when Anita kept wrongly referring to women as objects and possessions? Well, she's at it again. She shows a clip from The Darkness 2, in which the main character watches his wife be murdered in front of him, with the murderer saying, "I take from you." Anita says that this implies that she belonged to him, that she was his possession. Once wrong, the hero must go get his possessions back. No, that is not the implication. The line is, "I take from you," that he's going to take the person he most cared about away from his life, that he will no longer have his wife in his life. Referring to her as his wife does not imply that she was his property or even that the villain was making that implication. Once again, Anita is overeager to jump at the chance to show her audience that some woman somewhere in some fictional game universe was being referred to as a possession. Trigger warning, heavy sexism coming up. On the surface, victimized women are framed as the reason for the hero's torment, but if we dig a little deeper into the subtext, I'd argue that the true source of this stems from feelings of weakness and or guilt of his failure to perform his socially prescribed patriarchal duty to protect his women and children. Can men not love Anita? Of course they feel protective over the ones they love. I do. Now I would say it's even expected me to, even though I have these. She says, protect his children. No fucking shit. These ones that are going to rescue their kids, they're parents. The ones that have their kids die, they're parents. They're going to feel guilt. A very strong emotion. There is a reason why you hear or read the line, "This is all my fault," or something similar to that in books, movies, TV, games, and real life. But obviously it's none of that and just society's fault. She elaborates with, in this way, these failed hero stories are really about his perceived loss of masculinity and then the quest to regain that masculinity primarily by exerting dominance and control through the performance of violence on others. Oh wait, it's men's fault again. Is Anita really so sexist that she looks for perceived misogyny and applies pseudo-outrage everywhere? Gosh, that tinfoil hat must be really tight. She then goes on to say that revenge-based narratives can be harmful to men because they further help to limit the possible responses men are allowed to have when faced with death or tragedy. But this is just revenge for loss of power, not because of a loved one's life, right, Anita? I really don't think it's being harmful. It falls under anger, one of the 5 stages of grief. She gives some examples of games that go about grief in other ways, including Dear Esther. That is all fine and well. And though I would say that Dear Esther is more of an interactive short film, an experience, than a game. Don't worry, we're almost done. Violence against women is a serious global epidemic. Therefore, attempts to address this issue in a fictional context demands a considerable degree of respect, subtlety, and nuance. Women shouldn't be mere disposable objects or symbolic pawns in stories about men and their own struggles with patriarchal expectations and inadequacy. I detect a slippery slope. You just can't say it should be shown a certain way and not to do in ways that are irresponsible. To say that there is a right or a wrong way to show certain parts of life, like the female gender, or violence against women, or even in fictional ways, it will just snowball its way to censorship. If a developer wants to show violence against women in a respectful way, good for them. And if another does so in a way that you feel doesn't, well, that is their right too. Damn, girl, do something about those eyebrows already. Developers